ballroom of the Sterling Heights Country Club smelled of floor wax, chilled champagne, and a desperate, clinging kind of terror that no amount of expensive jewelry could mask. It was June 1954, and the air in Greenwich, Connecticut, was thick with the scent of mown grass and the silent rattling of skeletons in closets. Leopold Leo St. Clair stood near a marble pillar, his posture as impeccable as the silk lining of his Savile Row tuxedo. He didn't need to see the balance sheets of the guests to know who was drowning. He only needed to breathe. As Mrs. Penelope Vanderbilt Hyde glided past him, draped in a mink stole that had seen better decades, Leo felt a sharp, metallic tang at the back of his throat. It was her perfume, a legendary French floral that should have smelled of jasmine and sun-drenched grass. Instead, it carried a faint, sour undertone of synthetic aldehydes and industrial-grade ethanol. "She's bankrupt," Leo whispered, the words barely a ripple in the humid night air. "Beg pardon?" He turned to see a young woman standing near the hors d'oeuvres table. She was dressed in a simple, off-the-rack navy gown that screamed department store, but her eyes were sharp, scanning the room with the clinical detachment of a hawk. She held a small notebook and a fountain pen, her fingers stained with blue ink. "The perfume," Leo said, inclining his head toward the receding Penelope. "It's a counterfeit, a clever one, but the base notes are cheap. A woman of her standing only buys a knockoff when the family trust has run dry and the creditors are at the gate. She is projecting an aura of wealth that no longer exists." The young woman looked at Penelope, then back at Leo. She flipped a page in her notebook. "That would explain the liquidation of the Hyde Vanderbilt textile mills last Tuesday," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Their stocks dropped 40 points in the morning session, yet here she is, wearing a necklace that could buy a small town. I'm Catherine Cassidy. Most people call me Kit." "Leopold St. Clair," he replied, intrigued. "And what is a statistical hawk doing in a den of peacocks, Miss Cassidy?" "I'm an assistant auditor for the firm handling the club's accounts," she said, finally looking him in the eye. "I find that people lie with their words and their clothes, but the numbers never blink. However, I didn't know someone could audit a bank account with their nose." Leo smiled, a thin, aristocratic curve of the lips. "In my world, scent is the ultimate ledger. It is the only thing the nouveau riche cannot fake and the old money cannot hide. But I am an exile, Miss Cassidy. My family's house in France was taken by the war and the lawyers. I have the nose, but I lack the ledger." Kit looked around the room, her mind already calculating. She saw the vanity, the fear of social irrelevance, and the immense, stagnant pools of capital sitting in the room. She looked at Leo, a man who looked like a prince but smelled of ambition. "You know," Kit said, tapping her pen against her chin, "these people insure their houses, their horses, and their yachts. They protect their names with layers of legal trusts, but they have no protection for their identity. If I can prove that a signature scent can be treated as a physical asset, an intangible intellectual property tied to their family estate, we could create a new kind of investment, an olfactory trust." Leo's eyes brightened. "A scent that cannot be bought in a store, a formula held in escrow, a fragrance that signifies ownership. I can handle the mathematics of the risk and the structure of the contracts," Kit said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hum. "You provide the exclusivity and the chemistry. We don't sell bottles, Leo. We sell the scent of permanence." Outside, a summer storm began to brew over the Long Island Sound. In the flickering light of the chandeliers, a disgraced aristocrat and a daughter of Irish immigrants shook hands. They didn't know it yet, but they had just smelled the first windfall of a multi-million-dollar empire. The air in Greenwich was about to change forever. The mahogany row offices of the Greenwich Union Bank were designed to radiate silence and stability. It was a space where the air usually smelled of old paper, floor wax, and the dry metallic tang of cold cash. But on this Tuesday morning in 1955, the air in the boardroom had been replaced by something unsettlingly evocative. It smelled of a coastal rainstorm in Maine, salty, crisp, and undeniably expensive. Leo St. Clair stood at the head of the table, his hands resting lightly on a small, velvet-lined case. Opposite him sat Arthur Sterling, the bank's president, a man whose family had dictated the interest rates of New England since the turn of the century. "You're telling me, Mr. St. Clair," Sterling began, leaning back until his leather chair creaked, "that you want the bank to finance a project that possesses no physical inventory, no machinery, and no real estate? You want a line of credit based on vapor?" Kit Cassidy stepped forward from the shadows of the corner, clutching a stack of actuarial tables. She didn't look like an assistant anymore. She looked like an architect of a new reality. "Not vapor, Mr. Sterling. Intellectual property. We aren't asking for a loan to build a factory. We are asking for the bank to act as the primary trustee for the St. Clair Olfactory Reserve." She began laying out the documents across the polished table. Each page was a masterpiece of statistical manipulation. "We have calculated the brand equity of presence. When a client enters this bank, they are greeted by the same architecture as every other bank in the county. But if this bank possessed a unique copyrighted olfactory signature, one that was psychologically tied to feelings of security and trust, you create an intangible asset that your competitors cannot replicate. We call it atmospheric collateral." Leo opened the velvet case. Inside was a single crystal vial filled with a clear liquid. "This, Arthur, is sterling gold number 1. It took 3 months to balance. It contains rare ambergris and a specific distillation of cedarwood that only grows on one private estate in Lebanon. If we sign this contract, you won't just own the scent. You will own the exclusive right to the molecules. We will file the formula in your own vault, categorized as a trade secret under the same legal protections as the formula for Coca-Cola." The financial hook was Kit's masterpiece. She didn't propose a simple sale. She proposed a membership unit system. The bank would provide a $100,000 credit line, an enormous sum for 1955, and in exchange, they would receive 10% of all future royalties from the Fragrance Trust. Furthermore, every wealthy client who wanted their own family signature would have to open a dedicated escrow account at Greenwich Union to fund the acquisition of the raw materials. "You're turning my bank into a warehouse for perfume ingredients," Sterling muttered, though his eyes were fixed on the crystal vial. "We are turning your bank into the center of the New England Social Registry," Kit corrected him. "Imagine the Forbes family or the Rockefellers wanting their own signature. They will come to you to manage the trust. You won't just be holding their money. You'll be holding their legacy." Arthur Sterling reached out and picked up the vial. He uncorked it, and for a moment the boardroom disappeared. He wasn't a banker in a gray suit. He was a boy again, standing on the deck of his father's yacht, feeling the spray of the Atlantic. The emotional resonance was undeniable. "The legal structure," Sterling asked, his voice lower now. "How do we ensure these families don't just take the formula to a cheaper chemist?" "That is the beauty of the trust," Kit replied, sliding a final contract toward him. By the spring of 1956, the Whisper campaign had turned into a roar. In the manicured gardens of Connecticut and the wood-paneled smoking rooms of Manhattan, the name St. Clair and Cassidy was spoken with the kind of reverence usually reserved for Swiss bankers or divine providence. The financial reality was simple. They had successfully created a market where none existed by weaponizing the most powerful currency in America: exclusivity. The turning point came on a humid Tuesday morning when the Greenwich time hit the doorsteps of the wealthy. The front page of the living section didn't feature the usual debutante ball or a local charity drive. Instead, the headline read, "The New Currency of Class: Why Greenwich is Trading Coins for Cents." The article was a masterpiece of leaked information, likely orchestrated by Kit over a series of high-priced lunches with the society editor. It described in breathless detail how the old money dynasties were no longer content with store-bought French labels. It spoke of vaulted formulas and olfactory signatures that were being written into the very deeds of the colonial mansions. "Look at this," Kit said, sliding the newspaper across the desk of their new office, a sleek, minimalist space overlooking the harbor. "They're calling it the Invisible Crest. The wait list just tripled in 48 hours. Every family that didn't get invited to our initial offering is now terrified they're falling behind the times." Leo, dressed in a charcoal-colored silk waistcoat, was meticulously weighing drops of vetiver from a batch that had arrived from Haiti. He didn't look at the paper. "Fear is a powerful solvent, Kit. It dissolves even the most stubborn common sense. But we have a problem. The demand is exceeding our supply of raw materials. To maintain the reserve, we need more than just a bank loan. We need a hedge. This led to their next financial evolution, the aromatic unit bond. Kit had realized that as the brand grew, the cost of rare ingredients, ambergris from the Indian Ocean, Bulgarian rose otto, and Mysore sandalwood, was volatile. To protect the trust's margins, she designed a private bond offering for their top-tier clients. Instead of paying for their scents in cash, clients could invest in the St. Clair Raw Material Fund. It's a commodity play, Kit explained to a group of skeptical investors at the yacht club. You aren't just buying a bottle of perfume, you are buying shares of the global harvest. As these ingredients become rarer, the value of your units increases. If you ever decide to leave the trust, we buy back your units at the current market rate. You're essentially hedging your own vanity against global inflation. One of the investors, a silver-haired shipping magnate named Silas Thorne, leaned forward. So, you're saying if a drought hits the rose fields in Europe, my wife's perfume becomes a more valuable asset on my balance sheet? Exactly, Kit replied, her voice as cool as the harbor breeze. And because we control the only certified laboratory capable of processing these units into the final signature, you have a captive market. We aren't just a boutique, Mr. Thorne. We are a private exchange. The plan was a triumph. Within a month, they had secured $500,000 in private capital. This wasn't debt. It was equity in the very air. They used the funds to buy up 5 years' worth of global sandalwood production, effectively cornering the market for the most essential base note in masculine perfumery. By the end of 1957, the news reached the national stage. The Wall Street Journal ran a small intrigued column titled "The Fragrant Hedge, New England's Most Unusual Commodity Market." The Fragrance Trust was no longer a local curiosity. It was a financial machine. However, with national attention came the first eyes of the predators. In the shadows of New York's Chemical Row, the giants of the mass-market industry were beginning to take notice. They didn't like the idea of a private exchange they couldn't control. "The wind is shifting, Leo," Kit said one evening, looking at a stack of inquiries from rival firms. "People are starting to realize that we've turned the invisible into something very, very tangible. We need to be ready for when they try to steal the recipe." Leo corked a vial and looked at her. "Let them try. They can steal the recipe, but they can't steal the trust. In this town, people don't buy the scent. They buy the secret." The year 1958 brought a shift in the global atmosphere. The post-war exuberance was hardening into a cold, calculated pursuit of resource control. While the world watched the launch of satellites and the hardening of borders, Kit Cassidy was watching the weather patterns over the Indian Ocean. She had realized that the St. Clair Olfactory Reserve had a fatal flaw. It was a house built on biological accidents. "We are exposed, Leo," Kit said, spreading a thermal map across their glass-topped desk. "3/4 of our premium masculine signatures rely on ambergris. If a storm hits the whaling routes, or a single freighter goes down, our aromatic units will default. We aren't just selling scent, we're selling a promise we can't manufacture." Ambergris, the rare, waxy substance produced in the digestive systems of sperm whales, was the gold bullion of the perfume world. It was the only fixative that could make a scent last for decades on a silk scarf or a mahogany desk. It was also impossible to farm. You had to wait for the ocean to give it up. The financial hook of 1958 was the Floating Asset Syndicate. Kit convinced their most powerful investors, men who owned fleets of tankers and textile mills, to treat ambergris like oil or grain. She didn't buy the substance, she bought the rights to future discoveries. "We are issuing spot purchase credits to independent salvagers from the Maldives to the Azores," Kit explained to the board of the trust. "We pay them a monthly retainer to keep their finds off the open market. In exchange, we get the first right of refusal at a locked-in 1957 price. We aren't just hoarding a commodity, we are shorting the entire global supply." This was the first time futures had been applied to the art of smell. By December, St. Clair and Cassidy controlled 60% of the high-grade ambergris entering the United States. The price on the open market doubled, then tripled. Because they owned the supply, the value of their clients' olfactory units skyrocketed. A family who had invested $10,000 in the fund in 1955 now sat on an asset worth $45,000, and they were the only ones who could still afford to smell like the elite. The news broke in a sharp, envious piece in Barron's. The Whale in the Vault: How a Connecticut Startup Cornered the World's Rarest Fixative. The article painted Kit as a mathematical siren who had turned a luxury hobby into a ruthless commodity play. "They're calling us monopolists, Kit," Leo said, reading the article while sipping a dry martini. He looked tired. The pressure of maintaining the chemical purity of their massive new stockpiles was immense. "They call us monopolists because they're paying us 3 times the price for their base notes," Kit replied, her eyes fixed on a ledger. "The French houses in Grasse are screaming. They can't fulfill their orders for the New York department stores because we own the fixative. They've spent a century looking down on American taste, and now they have to beg us for the ingredients to satisfy it." The victory was sweet, but it came with a price. By cornering the market, they had moved from being a curiosity to being a target. The big three French perfume houses, names that had existed since the time of Napoleon, formed a secret coalition. They didn't want to buy from Leo and Kit. They wanted to break them. Late one night, a brick was thrown through the window of their laboratory. Attached was a note written on expensive, cream-colored stationery. It simply said, "The air belongs to everyone. For now." "It's a warning," Leo said, looking at the glass shards on the floor. "No," Kit said, picking up a piece of the glass. "It's an admission of defeat. They can't win on the balance sheet, so they're trying to win in the streets. We aren't just a trust anymore, Leo. We're a fortress." As 1958 came to a close, the Fragrance Trust had officially outgrown its origins. They were no longer just two partners in a shared dream. They were the guardians of a global supply chain, and by 1961, the world was on a knife edge. The Cold War had frozen international diplomacy, but in the fragrant fields of the Mediterranean and the wild coasts of the Indian Ocean, a hot war was brewing for the soul of the perfume industry. Political instability in Africa and the Middle East had sent the prices of raw resins and musk into a vertical climb. The French coalition, desperate to break the St. Clair and Cassidy monopoly, attempted a pincer maneuver. They moved to buy out the local collectors in the Levant, hoping to starve the American trust of its essential middle notes. "They are trying to squeeze our lungs, Leo," Kit said, slamming a telegram onto the desk. "Our supply of high-grade musk from the Red Sea has been intercepted. The French have offered the suppliers a 5-year exclusivity deal at 20% above our rate. They aren't just buying the product. They're buying our destruction." Leo looked at the empty shelf where the musk canisters usually sat. Without the musk, their scents would lose their skin-hugging warmth. They would become thin, ephemeral things. "We cannot outbid the combined wealth of the French houses, Kit. Not with our current cash reserves." But Kit didn't look defeated. She looked like a gambler who had just found an extra ace. "We don't need to outbid them. We need to make their bid irrelevant." The financial strategy for 1961 was the reverse buyback accord. Kit flew to Marseille, and then to the ports of the Red Sea, bypassing the brokers. She met with the heads of the small traditional harvesting families. She didn't offer them more money. She offered them a stake in the final product. "I told them that the French will buy their harvest once, and then forget them," Kit explained upon her return. "I offered them something the French never would, a downstream participation contract. We pay them a fair market price now, but they also receive a 1% royalty on every membership unit we sell that uses their specific harvest. We've turned our suppliers into our shareholders." This move was a financial earthquake. For the harvesters, it was the first time they had a seat at the table of the elite. They chose the trust over the French cash. But Kit wasn't finished. Because the French had already committed vast amounts of their liquidity to the intercept attempt, they were now short on cash for other essential fixatives. Fixatives that St. Clair and Cassidy still held in their massive 1958 stockpile. In a move of cold-blooded efficiency, Kit waited for the French houses to realize they were missing the very ambergris needed to finish their stolen musk scents. Then she opened a secondary trading desk in London. "We are offering our surplus ambergris to the French," Kit said with a sharp smile, "but only at the spot market peak price. We are effectively forcing them to pay for our entire expansion into the 1960s. The headlines in the Financial Times were brutal. "Grass in recoil, American trust forces French rivals into debt trap." The article detailed how the upstarts from Connecticut had used modern financial engineering to defeat a century of tradition. The battle for the harvest resulted in a massive windfall for the trust. They had defended their supply, turned their suppliers into loyal allies, and drained the treasury of their biggest rivals. By the end of 1962, St. Clair and Cassidy didn't just own the air in Greenwich, they owned the foundations of the global fragrance market. "We won, Kit," Leo said, standing on the balcony of their new corporate headquarters, the scent of triumph lingering in the air. "We won this round, Leo," she replied, looking at the flickering lights of the New York skyline. "But we're moving into a new decade. The young generation is coming, and they don't want their father's bank vault scents. They want something that smells like a riot. We have to figure out how to sell them the revolution." By 1965, the rigid social structures of the 1950s were melting away. The children of the Trust's original clients were coming of age, and they didn't want to smell like their father's mahogany row offices. They were heading to the Hamptons and the nightclubs of Manhattan, looking for something lighter, sharper, and more provocative. "The market is splitting, Leo," Kit said, watching the young elite boarding yachts in East Hampton. "If we don't capture the new blood, we become a museum. We need to launch a subsidiary. Something that feels like the edge of the world, but is still backed by our private reserve." They launched the Vanguard Collection, a line of scents designed for the younger generation. The financial model was equally modern, micro-equity subscriptions. Instead of a full estate trust, young professionals and heirs could buy a fractional interest in a high-end scent. It was the first step toward the democratization of luxury, allowing them to capture a massive new pool of capital from the rising youth market. However, the expansion brought a new, more insidious threat. In early 1968, a cheap synthetic imitation of their flagship scent, sterling gold, began appearing in department stores across the East Coast. It was called Golden Glory, and it was being sold for a fraction of the price by a shadowy discount firm out of New Jersey. "It's a mockery," Leo spat, smelling a sample from a department store. "It's 90% water and toxic industrial fixatives. It doesn't just smell wrong, it's an insult to the chemistry." "The lawyers say a trademark lawsuit could take years, Leo," Kit said, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the sales figures. "By the time we win, the Golden Glory will have diluted our brand into nothing. We don't fight this in the courtroom. We fight it in the pocketbook." Kit and Leo orchestrated a public integrity campaign. They didn't sue the manufacturer. They used their influence with the high society press and the rising fashion magazines. They conducted a controlled study, likely funded by the Trust, showing that the cheap dyes and synthetic fixatives in Golden Glory permanently stained and damaged expensive silk, cashmere, and fur. The news hit the papers like a lightning bolt. "Scent of destruction, why your discount perfume is ruining your wardrobe." The article featured photos of ruined designer dresses, allegedly the victims of the counterfeit's low-grade chemical base. The financial blow was immediate. High-end boutiques pulled the imitation off their shelves to avoid liability. The Golden Glory firm, unable to handle the sudden returns and the reputational collapse, filed for bankruptcy within months. Instead of losing money, Kit used the crisis to strengthen the trust. She announced the authentication levy. Starting in 1969, all trust members would pay a slightly higher annual fee to fund a purity guarantee. In exchange, every bottle would be sealed with a unique serialized wax seal and tracked in a private ledger. "We turned a threat into a price hike," Kit remarked as they reviewed the quarterly gains. "They aren't just paying for the smell anymore. They're paying for the security of knowing they aren't wearing trash." By the end of the decade, the St. Clair and Cassidy empire was untouchable. They had captured the youth, crushed the counterfeiters, and turned their clients' anxiety into a permanent revenue stream. They were entering the 1970s with more liquidity than some small nations, ready for the final pivot into the future. As the calendar turned to 1971, the American economy began to fracture. The Bretton Woods system collapsed. The dollar was delinked from gold, and the first tremors of the oil crisis sent the cost of international shipping into the stratosphere. In the quiet halls of the Fragrance Trust, the ledger was bleeding. "The natural world is becoming too expensive, Leo," Kit said, reviewing the latest invoices for Mysore sandalwood and Haitian vetiver. "With the inflation rate climbing and the dollar weakening, our aromatic units are starting to feel like a burden to our clients rather than a hedge. If we keep raising the membership fees to cover the raw costs, We'll price ourselves into extinction." Leo looked at his laboratory, a place that had always been a sanctuary of organic purity. "You're suggesting we use synthetics? Like the mass-market filth we've spent 20 years fighting?" "I'm suggesting we reinvent the definition of rare," Kit replied, pulling out a folder marked Project Aurora. "We don't call them synthetics. We call them space-age molecules. The public is obsessed with the Apollo missions and the technology of the future. If we can't afford the Earth's harvest, we'll sell them the harvest of the stars." The financial hook of 1971 was the technical innovation recapitalization. Kit secured a massive federal research grant under the guise of aerospace chemical stabilization. She used this capital to build a state-of-the-art molecular laboratory. They hired the most brilliant young chemists from MIT to create entirely new lab-grown scent molecules, substances that didn't exist in nature and, more importantly, could be patented. They rebranded the entire trust. The old heavy wooden leather scents were phased out for the Nebula series. These scents used high-tech synthetic musks and ozone notes that were incredibly cheap to produce in a lab, but were marketed as the result of galactic research. The news in Scientific American and the New York Times was ecstatic. From the lab to the lobby, how St. Clair is rewriting the chemistry of luxury. The press fell for it completely. By framing the move to synthetics as a technological breakthrough rather than a cost-cutting measure, Kit managed to maintain their astronomical price points while slashing their production costs by 70%. "We've decoupled our profit from the soil, Leo," Kit said, showing him the new margins. "We no longer care about droughts in Bulgaria or political coups in Africa. Our supply chain now starts and ends in our own laboratory. We have achieved total vertical integration." The synthetic maneuver was a masterstroke of financial survival. While other luxury brands were collapsing under the weight of rising raw material costs, St. Clair and Cassidy saw their most profitable year in history. They had successfully transitioned their clients from the old world of biological scarcity to the new world of proprietary technology. However, Leo felt the weight of the change. He was no longer a perfumer. He was a CEO of a chemical interest. He looked at the gleaming steel vats that had replaced his oak barrels and realized that the invisible trust they had built was now a very visible, very powerful corporate machine. "We have everything we ever wanted, Kit," Leo said, his voice echoing in the sterile lab. "The money, the power, the security. But do you ever miss the smell of the real rain?" Kit looked at the flickering computer monitors that now tracked their global sales in real time. "Real rain is unpredictable, Leo. Unpredictable things are bad for the shareholders. We're in the business of certainty now." As 1972 came to a close, the stage was set for the final act. They had conquered the market, survived the crisis, and automated the soul of their business. It was time to decide how the story would end. By the spring of 1973, the atmosphere in America had turned clinical. The St. Clair and Cassidy empire was no longer a boutique secret of the Greenwich elite. It was a high-frequency financial engine. The aromatic units, that had started as a whimsical investment for socialites, were now traded with the same cold intensity as oil or gold. However, the world was changing. The era of the individualist was giving way to the era of the conglomerate, and Kit Cassidy knew that the most successful exit is the one you take while you still own the room. The final act began with a cover story in Fortune magazine. The headline, etched in bold gold-foiled lettering, read, "The Alchemists of Exit: How the Fragrance Trust Defined a Century of Wealth." The article was a 10-page retrospective on how a disgraced French nose and a statistical genius had transformed the invisible into a multi-million-dollar asset class. "It's time, Leo," Kit said, placing the magazine on his desk. She was dressed in a sleek ivory power suit, her eyes reflecting the digital hum of the office. "The aesthetic matrix predicts a decade of corporate consolidation. If we stay independent, we'll spend the next 10 years fighting patent lawsuits and hostile takeovers. But if we sell now, we sell the legend." The final financial maneuver, the legacy liquidation, was as elegant as a bass note of pure musk. Instead of selling to a rival perfume house, Kit and Leo sold the controlling interest of the Fragrance Trust to a global Swiss-American chemical and pharmaceutical conglomerate. The terms of the deal were staggering. The conglomerate didn't just buy the factories and the patents. They bought the management systems. The St. Clair Olfactory Trust was converted into a permanent family office, a private investment vehicle that would manage the generational wealth of their original clients for a perpetual fee. Leo and Kit walked away with a combined personal payout of nearly $40 million, a king's ransom in 1973, while retaining a lifetime consultancy role that required absolutely no labor. On their final evening in Greenwich, they returned to the Sterling Heights Country Club, the place where it had all begun 19 years earlier. The ballroom still smelled of floor wax and champagne, but the guests were different. They were younger, louder, and their scents were lighter, designed in the very labs Leo had helped build. "Look at them," Leo said, standing by the same marble pillar. He pulled a small, unlabeled vial from his pocket. It contained the very last of the 1954 sterling gold, the original natural formula with the rare Lebanese cedar and genuine ambergris. "They're wearing Nebula number 5. It's efficient, it's profitable, but it doesn't have a soul." Kit took the vial and uncorked it. For a moment, the sterile, synthetic 1970s air was pierced by the scent of a coastal rainstorm in Maine. It was deep, complex, and hauntingly real. "Soul isn't a line item on a balance sheet, Leo," Kit said softly. "We gave them exactly what they wanted, the ability to smell like success without the inconvenience of nature. We sold them a dream that never fades, and in return, they gave us the world." The news of their retirement was treated like the departure of royalty. The Greenwich Time ran a final, respectful editorial titled "The Last of the Gilded Noses." It spoke of how they had taken the vanity of the town and turned it into the most stable capital in America. Leo and Kit didn't stay for the tributes. They had already chartered a private jet to a villa in the south of France, near the fields of grass, where Leo's ancestors had once walked. They weren't going back as exiles. They were going back as the people who had mastered the modern world. The Fragrance Trust continued to operate, a silent machine in the background of American high society, its formulas locked in vaults, its royalties flowing into offshore accounts. The scent of old blood had been replaced by the scent of pure, clean, synthetic gold. As the sun set over the Long Island Sound, the last trail of the original sterling gold vanished into the night, leaving behind nothing but the cold, perfect logic of a legacy fulfilled.